The ink was not yet dry on the fraudulent papers when my son-in-law handed me the glossy brochure for the nursing home. He called it planning for my future, a comfortable place for my twilight years. He smiled that predatory smile of his, all teeth and no warmth. I looked at the forged signature, my own name staring back at me, a clumsy imitation. In that moment, I did not see it as planning. I saw it as motive, and I, a retired judge, knew exactly what to do with motive. It began, as these things often do, in my own kitchen. The scent of brewing coffee hung in the air, a familiar comfort soon to be shattered. My daughter, Emily, stood by the counter, wringing her hands, a portrait of feigned concern. Her husband, Mark, sat at my heavy oak table, the one Helen and I had picked out decades ago. He slid a sheaf of papers across the polished surface. His movements were slick, practiced, like a shark gliding through water. He was a lawyer, and he carried the profession's arrogance like a shield. "This is just a formality, Dad," Emily said, her voice a little too high. "Mark says it is for the best. It will allow him to help you manage your finances. You know, take some of the burden off you." The word manage hung in the air, foul and heavy. I looked at the document. Power of attorney. It granted Mark sweeping control over every asset I had spent a lifetime accumulating. My pension, my home, my investments, everything. All that was needed was my signature. I looked at Mark. His expensive suit was probably worth more than my first car. He wore a watch that gleamed under the kitchen lights, a monument to unearned success. His own law practice, I knew, was floundering, a sinking ship propped up by a mountain of debt. He saw my life's work not as a legacy, but as a lifeline, a bailout package to fund his and Emily's extravagant lifestyle. He met my gaze without a flicker of shame, only impatience. "I will think about it," I said, my voice even. I pushed the papers back toward him. Mark's smile tightened at the edges. "Of course, David. Take your time, but do not take too long. These things are time-sensitive." He tapped the document with a manicured finger. Later that evening, after they had left, I found another copy of the document in my study. This one was different. At the bottom, in a shaky, unconvincing scrawl, was my name. The forgery was clumsy, arrogant. He had assumed I would either not notice or be too frail to do anything about it. He had judged me incompetent. It was a common mistake people made when they looked at me, with my gray hair and the slight tremor in my hand. They saw the shell, not the machinery whirring inside. They did not see the man who had presided over hundreds of trials, who could dismantle a fallacious argument before the lawyer had even finished his sentence. They did not see the mind that had memorized entire volumes of case law. Mark had made a fatal error in his legal calculus. He had misjudged the judge. My first instinct was rage, a white-hot inferno that threatened to consume me. I wanted to call them, to roar my fury into the phone, to threaten them with the full weight of the law I once embodied. But then a deeper, colder instinct took over, honed by 40 years on the bench. Rage was a wildfire, destructive and chaotic. What I needed now was ice. I needed precision. I needed a plan. Vengeance is a dish best served cold, the saying goes. I preferred to serve it under the harsh, fluorescent lights of a courtroom. Instead of shouting, I smiled. It was a thin, grim smile, a sight unseen on my face for many years. I walked over to my liquor cabinet and poured a small measure of whiskey. The good stuff I saved for special occasions. This, I decided, was a special occasion. It was the beginning of the last great case of my career, the people versus Mark and Emily. I took a sip, the fiery liquid a stark contrast to the glacial calm settling over me. I sat down at my desk and began to write. I did not write a letter of accusation. I wrote a list. On one side, I listed every asset I owned. On the other, I outlined every legal tool at my disposal. Forgery, felony theft, wire fraud, since he would surely use online banking, conspiracy, and for a lawyer like Mark, the ultimate consequence, disbarment. His entire professional identity, the source of his smoke superiority, was a house of cards. I intended to pull out the foundation and watch it all come crashing down around him. My mind, which had felt sluggish with the gentle pace of retirement, was now electric. The old pathways, the ones that connected precedent to procedure, lit up like a city at dusk. I felt a clarity I had not experienced in years. In his greed, Mark had given me a gift. He had given me a purpose. My world was no longer just about crossword puzzles and doctor appointments. It was about strategy. It was about justice. The old lion had been sleeping, but now he was awake, and he was hungry. The next morning, I made a single phone call. The number was one I knew by heart, though I had not dialed it in 5 years. Sarah Jenkins had been my law clerk, straight out of school, a brilliant young woman with a fierce intellect and an unshakable moral core. She was now a senior prosecutor in the district attorney's office, a rising star. She answered on the second ring, her voice professional and crisp. "Judge Thompson, is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, Sarah," I said, my tone light, casual. "I have a hypothetical legal question for you. I find myself with some time on my hands and my mind wanders to old puzzles." I laid out the scenario for her, speaking in detached, academic terms. An elderly individual, a forged power of attorney, a son-in-law, an officer of the court, who is the primary perpetrator. What would the DA's office consider its primary challenges in prosecuting such a case? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the gears turning in her sharp mind. She knew me well enough to understand that I never dealt in hypotheticals. "Judge," she said, her voice dropping to a more serious register, "the main challenge is always proving intent and securing credible evidence, especially if the victim is perceived as confused or unreliable. We would need incontrovertible proof, bank records, handwriting analysis, and ideally, corroborating testimony. Is this a personal matter?" "Let us just say I am taking a keen interest in the subject," I replied. "Thank you for your time, Sarah. Keep your schedule for the State Bar Ethics Committee open in the coming weeks. You might find a case of particular interest appearing on the docket." I hung up before she could ask more questions. The first piece was on the board. Now I needed to let my opponent make his move. And I knew exactly how to bait the trap. I went to my bank the next day. I spoke with the manager, a pleasant man named Mr. Henderson, whom I had known for years. I did not mention the forgery. Instead, I explained that I was restructuring my estate and wanted to place a temporary freeze on any large withdrawals or transfers from my accounts. I also requested a special alert, one that would notify me by a private email address if any new legal documents, such as a power of attorney, were presented. Mr. Henderson was happy to oblige, seeing it as the prudent action of a man getting his affairs in order. He assured me of the bank's discretion and security. I left feeling a small measure of satisfaction. Mark could file the paperwork, but the moment he tried to access a single dollar, an alarm would sound that only I could hear. He was walking into a digital tripwire of my own design. The first piece of evidence would be electronically time-stamped and delivered directly to me. Next, I visited a quiet cafe and called Helen. Our divorce had been difficult, born of my long hours on the bench and a slow, painful drifting apart. We had not spoken in over a year, our conversations always polite but distant, like two strangers who once shared a life. This time, I did not call to reminisce or apologize. I called for a specific reason. "Helen," I said, after the initial awkward pleasantries, "I need to ask you about the money." I could feel her stiffen over the phone. "David, that was settled years ago." "I know," I said gently, "but I need you to remember the circumstances. Do you still have the letter I wrote you when I transferred the funds into your name? The letter that explained it was a gift, a provision for your future, entirely separate from my own estate?" Her silence was my answer. I knew she kept everything. She was a curator of our shared history, even the painful parts. "I have it somewhere," she said, her voice softening slightly. "In a box with your old letters." "Why?" "It's important, Helen. Extremely important." "Could you fight it and have it notarized? Create a sworn affidavit testifying that the money was a gift, free and clear. It might seem strange, but please, trust me on this." I did not explain further. I did not want to burden her with the sordid details of Emily and Mark's betrayal. Not yet. After a moment, she simply said, I will. Mark and Emily were trying to steal money that was not in a legal sense even mine to be stolen. It had been Helen's property for over a decade. This fact transformed Mark's crime from a simple, albeit felonious theft, into something far more complex. He was attempting to liquidate an asset I had no legal claim to, using a fraudulent document. This single point of fact would be the fulcrum upon which I would lever his entire world off its axis. It was a beautiful, elegant point of law. A week passed in silence. I went about my routine, tending my garden and reading. To any outside observer, I was just a lonely old man. But inside, I was a general preparing for battle. I gathered my own evidence. I found old documents with my authentic signature and placed them in a safe deposit box. I made a detailed timeline of events, noting the date and time of their visit and the discovery of the forgery. My legal training demanded diligence, a chain of evidence with no weak links. Then came the escalation. It was far more clumsy and cruel than I had anticipated, which told me Mark was getting desperate. He had likely presented the POA to the bank, only to be told of the freeze on the account. Frustrated, he had decided to change tactics. Instead of attacking my finances, he decided to attack my mind. My daughter Emily called, her voice trembling with what I am sure she thought was convincing sorrow. Dad, we are worried about you. Worried? I asked, feigning confusion. I feel fine. No, Dad, you have been forgetful, confused. Mark and I have been talking. We think it would be a good idea for you to have an evaluation, just to make sure you are okay. The doctor friend of Mark's can come by the house. It will be very discreet. My blood ran cold. They were trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. It was a classic, vicious move. If they could get a doctor to sign off, the fraudulent POA would suddenly have the weight of medical authority behind it. They were no longer just thieves. They were ghouls trying to bury me alive. They wanted to strip me of my assets, my home, and my very autonomy. I saw Mark's hand in this immediately. It was the kind of overplayed, arrogant move a cornered man would make. He thought he was playing chess, but he was just knocking over the pieces with his fists. He had no idea I was the one who had written the rulebook he was so flagrantly ignoring. That sounds like a wonderful idea, I said, injecting a note of tired resignation into my voice. Perhaps you are right. When should I expect the doctor? Emily sounded relieved. Tomorrow afternoon, Dad. Thank you for being so understanding. We just love you so much. The lie was so bald, so transparent, it was almost pitiable. I hung up the phone and made my second call to Sarah Jenkins. Sarah, I said, the hypothetical is no longer hypothetical. They are trying to have me committed. The line was silent for a full 10 seconds. Then Sarah's voice came back, devoid of all pleasantries. It was the voice of a prosecutor who smelled blood in the water. Tell me everything, Judge, and do not leave out a single detail. For the next hour, I laid out the entire story, from the forged document to the impending visit from Mark's pet doctor. I told her about the bank alerts and my call to Helen. I was no longer a civilian. I was her star witness. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the doctor's visit is a gift, Judge. A clear act of escalation and malice. We can use it. Here's what you're going to do. She gave me a set of precise instructions. I was to record the entire interaction with the doctor. She would have a plainclothes officer parked down the street, merely as an observer. Do not let them know you are on to them, she warned. Act the part. Be the frail, confused old man they think you are. The next day, a man who looked more like a car salesman than a physician arrived at my door, Dr. Alistair Finch. He had a smug, self-satisfied air about him. Emily and Mark were with him, hovering like vultures. They ushered him into my living room, and he began his so-called evaluation. He asked me simplistic questions. Who is the president? What year is it? Where are you right now? I answered them slowly, with a feigned air of confusion, sometimes pretending to lose my train of thought. Then he moved on to more subjective questions about my mood and memory, guided by pointed comments from Mark. He often seems to forget conversations we have had, Mark would say, shaking his head sadly. He has become so reclusive and paranoid, Emily would add, dabbing a dry eye. It was a disgusting, pathetic performance. I watched them, my heart a cold, hard stone in my chest. This was my daughter, my own flesh and blood, participating in a conspiracy to erase me. Throughout the interview, a tiny digital recorder, a gift from my tech-savvy grandson years ago, was running silently in my shirt pocket. Every leading question from Dr. Finch, every false testament from Mark and Emily, was being captured. They were so confident in their scheme, so blinded by their own arrogance, that they never once suspected the feeble old man in the armchair was meticulously documenting his own persecution. It was a masterclass in hubris. After an hour, Dr. Finch closed his notepad with a grave look. He turned to Mark and Emily. "I agree," he said, his voice dripping with false empathy. "There are clear signs of cognitive decline and persecutory delusion. I recommend a 72-hour psychiatric hold for his own safety." Mark's face lit up with a triumphant gleam. He had his weapon. He thought he had won. He believed the next step was a quiet room in a hospital, followed by total control of my life. "Thank you, doctor," Mark said, shaking his hand with vigor. "We will make the arrangements immediately." They all stood up, ready to escort me to my new life as a ward of their greed. But I did not move. I simply looked up at them from my chair and allowed myself a small, cold smile. "That will not be necessary," I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong. All trace of feigned senility gone. "Dr. Finch, you have just committed perjury and conspired to commit medical fraud." The change in the room was instantaneous. The air crackled with shock. Mark's jaw went slack. Emily's face went pale. Dr. Finch blinked, his professional mask crumbling. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small digital recorder, placing it on the table between us. "I have recorded this entire fraudulent evaluation," I stated calmly. "My former law clerk, who is now a senior prosecutor, is keenly interested in your professional methods." I then turned my gaze to Mark. "And as for you, I have already filed a formal complaint with the State Bar Association regarding a certain forged signature on a power of attorney document. The hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks from today. I expect you, my daughter, and your good doctor here to be the star witnesses. Now, I believe you are all just leaving. Get out of my house." My voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of a gavel striking oak. It was the voice of judgment. They stared at me, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. They had not just underestimated me. They had walked into a meticulously prepared legal ambush. Dr. Finch was the first to break, grabbing his bag and practically running from the house without another word. Emily burst into tears, a pathetic, gulping sound. Mark stood frozen, his face ashen. The hunter had just realized he was the one caught in the snare. The calm was over. The storm had just begun. The 2 weeks leading up to the bar hearing were a quiet war. Mark's initial shock morphed into a blustering, impotent rage. I received a letter from his lawyer, a thinly veiled threat of a lawsuit for slander and emotional distress. It was a pathetic attempt at intimidation, full of legal jargon meant to frighten a layman. I read it, chuckled, and filed it away in my growing evidence folder under the tab labeled Desperation. It was another miscalculation on his part. "You do not threaten a judge with the law." Emily tried a different approach. She called me, sobbing, a dozen times a day. Her messages were a torrent of apologies and accusations, blaming Mark, blaming her own weakness, blaming me for being so difficult. I never answered. I never called back. Forgiveness was a currency she had not earned, and I was not in the business of offering charity. She needed to sit with the consequences of her choices, to understand the depth of her betrayal, without my comfort to soften the blow. Meanwhile, Sarah and I worked with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. She had the recording transcribed and authenticated. She subpoenaed Dr. Finch, who, faced with the loss of his medical license, was ready to cooperate fully and testify against Mark. A forensic handwriting analyst confirmed the signature on the POA was a forgery, his report stating it was a crude and overconfident imitation. Every piece of my plan was snapping into place with beautiful terrifying precision. A package arrived by courier one afternoon. It was from Helen. Inside was a notarized affidavit, signed in her elegant, familiar script. Tucked behind it were two of my old letters to her, the paper soft and thin with age. I opened one. The words I had written 30 years ago spoke of love, of hope, of wanting to ensure her future was secure no matter what happened to ours. Reading them felt like looking at a ghost. It was a reminder of the man I had been and a reinforcement of the man I had to be now. This was not just about money or a house. It was about my name, my legacy. It was about the principles I had dedicated my life to upholding. Mark and Emily had not just tried to rob me. They had tried to strip me of my dignity, my credibility, my very identity. They believed my life was over, that I was a relic to be cleared away. I was about to teach them that the foundations of the law are built on the bedrock of precedent, and I was the precedent they had foolishly ignored. I received word through a former colleague that Mark was in a state of financial collapse. He was selling his luxury car and had put a second mortgage on their ostentatious house, likely to pay his legal fees. He had built a life on the illusion of success, and now the illusion was evaporating. The pressure was mounting, not just from the Bar Association, but from the creditors who had bankrolled his charade for years. The wolves he had kept at bay with my anticipated money were now circling him. Sarah informed me that Emily had reached out to her office, seeking a deal. She was willing to testify against her husband in exchange for leniency. Sarah advised against it for the moment. Let them face the ethics committee together, she said. Let us see how their united front holds under the glare of official scrutiny. A cornered animal is predictable. Two cornered animals will often turn on each other. It was sound prosecutorial strategy, and I readily agreed. The night before the hearing, I could not sleep. I sat in my study, the house silent around me. I thought of Helen, of the family we had built, and the one that now lay in ruins. There was no joy in what I was doing, only a profound and weary sense of duty. I was performing a necessary, painful surgery, cutting away the diseased parts to save what little might remain. Justice, I had learned long ago, is rarely a celebration. More often than not, it is a quiet, solemn reckoning. I chose my suit carefully that morning. It was not my old judicial robes, but a simple, gray flannel suit, clean and well-pressed. It was the armor of a citizen, not a judge. I was here today as a victim, a petitioner seeking redress. But in my heart, I knew this was my courtroom, my final case. I was both the plaintiff and the final arbiter of a justice that had been long delayed. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The old man looking back had tired eyes, but they burned with a focused, unyielding light. The hearing room was a sterile wood-paneled chamber designed to intimidate. A long table was reserved for the 3 members of the ethics committee, men and women whose faces were impassive masks of professional neutrality. Mark and his lawyer sat at one table. Mark's face was pale and slick with sweat, his usual arrogance replaced by a frantic, hunted look. Emily sat beside him, looking small and broken, staring at her hands as if the fate of the world was written in her palms. I took my seat at the opposing table. I was alone. Sarah was in the gallery, an observer for now. Then, just as the hearing was about to begin, the doors opened and Helen walked in. She looked dignified, her silver hair coiled neatly, her expression calm. She did not look at me, but took a seat in the back row. Her presence was a silent statement. She was here not for me, nor against me, but for the truth. Her presence fortified me more than an army of lawyers could have. A committee chair, a stern woman named Miss Albright, began the proceedings. Mark's lawyer started, his voice a drone of practiced legalese. He painted a picture of a loving daughter and son-in-law, deeply concerned for their aging, confused father. He claimed the power of attorney was a misunderstanding, a poorly executed attempt to help a man who was losing his grip on reality. He portrayed me as a vindictive patriarch, lashing out in a fit of senile paranoia. It was a weak, pathetic defense. Then it was my turn to speak. I did not rise. I remained seated, my hands resting on the table before me. I did not raise my voice. I simply told the story from the beginning, with the dispassionate clarity of a judge reading a verdict. I spoke of their visit, the forgery, the bank alerts. I detailed their lavish lifestyle and Mark's failing law practice, establishing a clear and compelling motive. I laid brick upon brick, building a wall of fact from which there was no escape. The committee members listened intently, their pens scratching notes. Mark shifted in his seat, whispering urgently to his lawyer, who was beginning to look unnerved. Emily had begun to weep silently. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle in the quiet room. Now, I said, let us discuss the attempt to have me involuntarily committed. I placed the small digital recorder on the table. With the committee's permission, I would like to play the audio of my psychiatric evaluation. For the next 20 minutes, the room was filled with the sound of their conspiracy. Mark's leading statements, Emily's false sobs, Dr. Finch's sham diagnosis. It was damning. It was irrefutable. When the recording ended, a heavy silence descended upon the room. Ms. Albright stared at Mark, her expression one of utter contempt. An officer of the court, conspiring to medically imprison his own father-in-law for financial gain. The air grew thick with his disgrace. Mark's lawyer, realizing his case was evaporating, tried to object. This is a violation of privacy, an illegal recording. Miss Albright cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand. Your client is an attorney, counselor. He should be aware of the state's one-party consent laws. Please, sit down. The rebuke was sharp, a public humiliation. Mark sank back into his chair, his face a mask of fury and fear. The first crack in his facade had appeared. I then presented the findings of the forensic handwriting expert. Copies of the report were distributed to the committee. The words, clumsy forgery and high degree of certainty, were highlighted. The paper trail was now complete. The motive was established. The criminal acts were detailed. But I had saved the most devastating blow for last. I had saved the revelation that would utterly demolish not just his career, but his entire perception of the events. But let us, for a moment, I said, my voice dropping slightly, examine the prize my son-in-law was so eager to claim. The primary asset he attempted to liquidate was a substantial investment portfolio. He believed this was my life savings, a nest egg he could raid to solve his financial troubles. He was, however, operating under a critical misunderstanding. I paused, looking directly at Mark, whose eyes were wide with confusion. I then presented Helen's affidavit. The portfolio he tried to steal was not and has not been my legal property for over a decade. In the year following my divorce, I gifted those funds in their entirety to my ex-wife, Helen Thompson, as a provision for her future. The transfer was accompanied by a letter making my intent clear. I placed a copy of my old handwritten letter on the table. The committee members read the documents, their eyebrows rising in unison. This changed everything. It was no longer just about forgery and attempted theft from a family member. It was about a lawyer using fraudulent means to attempt to seize assets to which his supposed client had no legal claim whatsoever. It demonstrated a level of professional incompetence and malicious recklessness that was breathtaking. He had not even performed the most basic due diligence. His entire crime was predicated on a greedy, fatal assumption. That was when Mark finally broke. He leaped to his feet, his chair clattering backwards. "He is lying," he screamed, his voice cracking, pointing a trembling finger at me. "It is a trick, a conspiracy between him and that old woman." His professional demeanor shattered, revealing the desperate, snarling animal beneath. He was a cornered rat, biting at the bars of a cage he had built for himself. All eyes in the room were on him, watching his spectacular self-immolation. His lawyer tried to restrain him, but Mark shoved him away. "He is the fraud, the manipulative old bastard playing his games. He has always hated me. Emily, tell them how he has poisoned you against me." He turned to his wife, his face contorted in a desperate plea. But Emily was no longer on his side. She stared at him, her eyes filled not with love or loyalty, but with the cold, hard clarity of betrayal. She had finally seen him for what he was. "You told me the money was his," she whispered, her voice just loud enough to carry in the silent room. "You told me he was sick, that we were helping him." You lied about everything." The words hung in the air, a final public severing of their toxic alliance. Mark stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He had lost everything, all at once. Miss Albright banged her gavel. "That is enough. Mr. Thompson, your testimony has been illuminating. We have all we need. The committee will deliberate, but I think we all know the direction this is heading." Her words were a death sentence for Mark's career. As she spoke, Sarah Jenkins rose from her seat in the gallery and walked to the front of the room, accompanied by two uniformed court officers. She held a warrant in her hand. "Mark Harrison," she said, her voice clear and official. "You are under arrest for the crimes of felony forgery, attempted grand larceny, and conspiracy." The officers stepped forward and placed Mark's hands behind his back. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a lock turning, a door closing, a life ending. It was the sound of justice. Mark did not resist. All the fight had gone out of him. He looked like a puppet with its strings cut. As they led him away, his eyes met mine one last time. There was no anger in them now, only a hollow, bottomless despair. He had played a high-stakes game against the master, and he had lost in the most public and humiliating way possible. He had misjudged the judge, and now he would pay the price. In the aftermath, the room slowly emptied. Emily remained, slumped in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably. A part of me, the father, wanted to go to her, to offer some semblance of comfort. But the judge in me knew she had to face this on her own. She had been a willing co-conspirator until the moment the ship had started to sink. Her tears were not for me. They were for herself. Reconciliation, if it were ever to happen, would be a long and difficult road, and it would begin with her taking the first step alone. I gathered my papers slowly, my movements deliberate. I felt the profound sense of exhaustion, the kind that follows a long and arduous battle. The victory was not sweet. It was grim and necessary. As I stood up to leave, Helen approached me. Her eyes were sad, but there was a look of respect in them I had not seen in years. "You did what you had to do, David," she said softly. She reached out and briefly touched my arm. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a bridge being built over a vast and troubled water. The legal fallout was swift and absolute. The state bar disbarred Mark permanently. Faced with the mountain of evidence against him, he accepted a plea bargain. Dr. Finch lost his medical license and faced his own set of charges. Emily, as a cooperating witness, received probation. She filed for divorce within a week. The lavish life they had built on a foundation of debt and deceit had crumbled to dust. Just as I had planned, I returned to my quiet house. It no longer felt like a place of confinement, a waiting room for the end. It felt like my home again, a sanctuary I had defended and won back. The silence was no longer lonely. It was peaceful. I had faced the ultimate betrayal from my own family and had not only survived, but prevailed. I had upheld the sanctity of the law, and in doing so, had reclaimed the sanctity of my own life. A few weeks later, there was a tentative knock on my door. It was Emily. She looked different, smaller, without her expensive clothes and facade of confidence. She held a small, simple plant in her hands. "Dad," she began, her voice choked with emotion. "I know I do not deserve it, but I came to ask for your forgiveness. I know now. I know what I did was wrong. I was weak, and I let Mark convince me. I am so sorry." I looked at my daughter, truly looked at her for the first time in years. I saw not the arrogant woman she had become, but the lost girl she had always been. "Forgiveness is not a gift, Emily," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "It is a process, and it starts with you forgiving yourself. But you are welcome to come in for a cup of coffee." It was not an absolution, but it was a beginning. A small, fragile seed of hope planted in the scorched earth of our family. Ellen started visiting for coffee as well. We did not talk about the past, about the trial, or our failed marriage. We talked about books, about gardening, about the funny things our grandson said. We were not falling back in love, but we were rediscovering a friendship that had been buried under years of resentment and pain. We were two old veterans of life, finding solace in each other's company, the quiet comfort of a shared history. I often sit in my study now, the same room where I discovered their betrayal, and I reflect. Family, respect, justice. They are not abstract concepts. They are living things that require constant vigilance and defense. Respect is not owed by age. It is earned by character. And justice is not just a function of the courts. It is a moral imperative that sometimes one must enforce personally, even at great cost. It is the final, unassailable bulwark against the darkness. They thought I was an old man, a relic of a bygone era, a chapter of the book that was already finished. They were wrong. I had one more case left in me, one final judgment to deliver. And in doing so, I wrote an ending they never saw coming, one where the old lion did not go quietly into the night, but roared one last time, reminding everyone that wisdom is a weapon, and the law, in the right hands, is the sharpest sword of all.